So today we're going to talk about China, and as we get started today, I want to tell you that this is probably one of the areas where I'm continuing to learn more and more about all the time. I have really enjoyed having some students in my classroom from China, and oftentimes they will bring new information and tell me stuff that I didn't know about it. So please use this video along with your reading and any other outside information that you want to help you understand more about Chinese history. Clearly, there's way more than what we could ever talk about in these few minutes I have here, but I want you to follow along in the class notes in the PowerPoint as I try to hit some highlights of things I want you to know about China. We need to begin with their environment. We need to start off with why China is so unique compared to some of the other civilizations that we've talked about, whether that's Mesopotamia, whether that's Egypt, or even India. China is unique because it is naturally isolated from everybody else. There are some natural barriers that keep invaders away and keeps China very much protected and isolated by itself. And one of those major boundaries are the rivers that they depend on, but also make it a good natural boundary. There are mountains as well that are important to keeping invaders out. And then, of course, later on, they're going to build that Great Wall with the intention of keeping people out or maybe keeping people in. So there's two key rivers that you need to keep note of. The first one is the Yellow River. The second one is the Yangtze River. They should be in your notes. If not, look those up and you can find out how to spell those. But those are the two key rivers that they depend on as their life source for crops, for irrigation, and for travel. So as we look through some of the civilization elements in China, it's important to note that we typically look at Chinese history by dynasty, as they didn't provide for us a lot of timeline other than by their ruling families. And their ruling families would rule for a period of time, and then somebody else would come in and take over, and they would rule, and then somebody else would take over. And so they keep track of their history by family ruling dynasties. And so I'm only going to hit a few of the key ones here. I know there's a lot more that we could go into. You can do some deeper study and research if you'd like to. One of the early ones is the Shah dynasty. They were led by an individual named Yu. Now there's some discrepancy as to whether this was a real dynasty or this was more mythical. However, I think it's also helpful for us to go back and to see them as one of the early ones because of the foundation for the tradition that they establish. Even if it was not a real dynasty, even if it was tradition, and it was built off of the legends that the supposed Yu dynasty had, or the Shah dynasty had. I think that's still vital to seeing the cycle as it repeats and as it moves forward. So their main contribution was learning how to control the floods and the rivers to help make their society prosperous, and using flood control, using irrigation from those two rivers to make them workable in their society. And so that was an important contribution for them. We don't have a whole lot of information about anything else, but a lot of the tradition we see from other dynasties goes back to the early Shah dynasty. We have the Shang dynasty. That's another important one. They were the first ones to leave us written records so that we can know a little bit more detail of what was going on with them. They built a lot of palaces and tombs all throughout China, that some of which still exist today. They had a capital city. The capital city's name was Anyang. I'm not real concerned that you know the name of the capital city, more of why this was an important one. It was built out of wood, and they surrounded it with walls for protection. They built up these huge dirt mounds around the city. They were 118 feet wide, and it stretched for 1.2 miles. And the reason why this is significant is, yes, it provided a defense for any invaders that were trying to come in, but it showed that the dynasty was able to control the population and control a large workforce, get them to do what the leaders of the dynasty wanted them to do. That was a huge step in the advancement of the Chinese culture. We do know, based off some of the written record and the artifacts left behind, that they were constantly at war. There were a lot of people who were trying to invade, hence building the dirt wall for almost 1.5 miles around the city. And then there was a lot of warring even within the the state within the group of people in this dynasty. We do know that they had professional warriors and that they developed their chariots that were led by horses, and this was a significant aspect to them being able to ward off any invaders. We move on to the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty is best known for its documentation of the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is one of those key concepts that you need to know for this section here, because the mandate of heaven becomes the way of life for the Chinese culture, because they believe that if there was a good ruler, he had divine approval, approval from the gods or whatever god they happen to be worshiping at that time. But a wicked or a foolish king could lose his right to rule and would be replaced by the gods. And so it brought along this justification of removing somebody that they thought was wicked, and they thought that if they were weak enough to be replaced by somebody else, then it must be a divine appointment, and that God had ordained that. The rulers liked to use this as well. As long as they were in power, they could say, well, the deity has deemed me responsible, and so therefore whatever I say goes, and if they've got a problem with it, they're going to remove me from power. You know, I think there's a lot of ways that could open up into corruption, and it certainly did. In the Zhou dynasty, we also see feudalism as the main way of life. This is where the kings allowed for the nobility to use the land, and they would be able to farm and live on the land. The payment or the rent that they would use for that land was their allegiance anytime there was a war that would come up. They would have to go fight on behalf of the king. And so the king would call them up and say, hey, it's time for you to come represent, to defend us, and they would be obligated. If you want a little insight on how this works, go watch the movie Mulan. However, there's some historical inaccuracies in that movie, but it gives you the general gist, an idea where every family had to send a representative, typically male. Once again, the whole point of the movie was that Mulan was female. But they did have to provide military service, protection for the king, and as long as they did that, then they got to use the land, they got to farm it, they got to make money off of it, and that was how that feudalistic society worked. The Zhou dynasty is also responsible for improving transportation, building roads, building canals, making life easier and better for not only the government, but also for the people who use those quite often. They are well documented as coining money and having a way of exchange in actual currency in their lifetime. They developed technology to be able to build cast iron materials. And this is something you would not see in Europe until later on in the Middle Ages, much later, almost 1,000 years later, that Europe would catch on to this technology. During this era, there was a lot of fighting in and among the people within the Zhou dynasty. And so there were people who were constantly trying to take over. The mandate of heaven was in full effect, and so they thought, well, maybe it's my time to be divinely appointed to that new position. There was a lot of fighting among the nobility that couldn't agree or who wanted a better position, wanted better land, and so there was a lot of fighting that went on there. And unfortunately, we see a lot of the values collapse in this era, in this dynasty. A lot of the family values, a lot of the moral ideas that perhaps some previous generations had exhibited, they begin to collapse here, and eventually a new dynasty is going to take over. I do want to talk a little bit about some general cultural things that you would see in the history of China. One of those, I guess, goes to the idea of the Middle Kingdom. They believed that they were kind of the center of the world, that they were the most important part of any civilization, any culture. So they viewed themselves very central to the way of life for the world. They labeled anybody who was outside of China as barbarian because they did not think that anybody else could have as an advanced cultural ideas or that they had as many technological advances. And for the most part, they were right, that many of the people outside of China did not have as significant of advancement as what they did. And they thought that they were the most important culture. I don't think this is too unique to China. I think a lot of cultures throughout history have thought the same idea. I think Americans are pretty guilty of that they believe that America is the best place, and that's for obvious biased reasons. We often think that our own culture and society is the best place to live in the world, and you probably should. And they also believed that the group was more important than the individual. So therefore, you should sacrifice your own desires, your own passions, your own ambitions for the betterment of the culture and the betterment of the society. So if that meant that you really had a passion, desire to go out and do music, and that's what you were born to do, but your family wanted you to go be an accountant, and that was what the government needed, they need more accountants, then you were going to have to give up your life of music to go out and be an accountant. In daily life, the family was one of the most important elements of their society. Respect your parents. That's a good rule to live by, no matter what culture and society you're in. The Bible clearly talks about that in Ephesians 6:1. But in this society, it was an element of belonging, that you respected your elders, you respected your parents. Family was the most critical element to their entire society. Women, unfortunately, were treated as inferior. Men had a higher place in the social structure. Women were treated as very low. They had their place. We see that evidence through arranged marriages where mom and dad would get to pick who you were going to marry, and you didn't get a chance to marry for love, for marry for your own decisions. So this was a really hard thing for a lot of people who had to put aside their own passions and desires to do whatever the family wanted. There was a lot of division between the nobility and the peasants. There was a huge divide between the upper class and the lower class, and that divide just continued to grow stronger and stronger. Religiously, many of the religious beliefs were tied close to the family. It was based on having that respect for your elders, listening to their wisdom, and then following through on that. They believed in an afterlife. They believed that ancestors would bless them or curse them based on how well they respected the family, and their ancestors could influence events in their life. When we look at their writing and the things that they've left behind for us, each character in their writing stands for a syllable. I know very little to nothing about Chinese writing, and this is one area where some of my students have helped me understand a little bit of it, but I will be honest that Chinese writing is just outside of my element here. From what I understand, there's very little link between the written language and the spoken language. There's a lot of difference between that. However, the writing is one of those things that did help unify a large territorial region that China has. Even if they could not speak the same language, their written language was close enough so that people from far ends of the Chinese civilization could communicate with one another in a written format. Now, they may not be able to speak well face to face, but they could write and they could get decrees from the rulers, and that made it workable. So there were a lot of characters that they had to memorize in order to understand the full Chinese language and the written alphabet. From what I understand, there's over 10,000 characters that you would have to know to fully master the entire Chinese language. And only the best of the best scholars would ever come close to knowing all of those. And from what some students have told me, it's one of those things that you know your particular dialect and you know your language elements, but you may not know the dialect from the north or the dialect from the south quite as well. And you might be able to figure it out, but it's not something you're fluent in being able to speak and understand. And the United States really doesn't have a good way to connect to that. And the English language really doesn't either, because it's not like a northern accent versus a southern accent where you can understand them. It's more of a change in the way that words are said. And again, this is something that's really beyond my true understanding. I would love for some of our Chinese students to help us understand that a little bit better. But it's very complicated. It's not something that's extremely easy to pick up, and it's not uniform among the entire Chinese nation. So that's some of the major elements that I want you to understand there about their culture. Make sure you're reading in the chapter and reach out to me if you got any questions. We'll talk to you later.